it's Jennifer from Flux. In this video, I'm going to show you how to crochet this gorgeous Raspberry Crumble Hat. This is a fun little project to make with some self-striping, really pretty yarn. We're going to be learning how to make the star stitch, and we're going to make an easy rectangle, and then we're going to seam it together, and then we're going to cinch the top and add this fun pom-pom. So I'm going to walk you through every step of the way, and this is a wonderful little hat that you can make for anyone. Now, I am going to show you later in the video too how to change the height of your hat and the circumference of it as well, so you can really get a custom fit on this hat. Now, my finished hat is about, the hat itself is about 9 inches tall and has a 20-inch circumference. And my pom-pom here is, let's see, it's about 3.5 inches tall. I made a nice, generously sized pom-pom. So we do get a fun swirl effect with the stitches, which we'll talk about later, and then also a fun multicolor pom-pom, which we're going to be assembling ourselves as well. So let's get started. For this project, you're going to need a pair of scissors, a tapestry needle, a tape measure. We're going to be using a 6mm J crochet hook. This is my Furls Odyssey hook, in case you're wondering. And then for our yarn, I'm going to be using 1 cake of Lion Brand's Ferris wheel. This is a really pretty kind of heathered, self-striping yarn. And for one of these cakes, they are 270 yards, 247 meters. And then if you need to substitute yarn, look for a yarn that recommends a 5mm H crochet hook and is a 4 medium on the yarn weight scale. Now you may notice that we're going up a couple hook sizes here to the J hook when it recommends the H hook. For the star stitch, the stitch we're going to be using, it kind of opens it up a little bit, so I went up to the J hook on that. And in case you're wondering about this beautiful color, it's called Wild Violets, and it does come in dye lots, just so you know also. Okay, so I have my hook, and when you have these yarn cakes, you might have to like dig around to find the end and pull out a little bit to get you started. We're going to begin by putting a slip knot on our hook. So what we want to do is wrap the yarn around our fingers to make a loop, bring the yarn behind the loop, reach in with your hook, bring up a loop, and tighten. Next, we're going to do our starting chain. Now, I wanted to say something about the starting chain. For the star stitch, you can use any odd number for the starting chain that you like. We're going to do a starting chain of 35. Now I'm going to make the chain and measure it to show you the length. And then usually when you work the star stitch back into the chain, which is what I'm going to show you also, it does shrink it down a little bit. So we're also going to measure at that point too, just to give you an idea of what we're working with here. The starting chain, because we're going to make a rectangle and seam it together, the starting chain is going to determine the height of your hat. So take that into consideration when you are doing your starting chain. If you need to change it, just use that odd number as your multiple. Any odd number would be fine, okay? We're going to start with a starting chain of 35. Now the number of rows worked will determine the circumference of the hat, okay? So how big around the hat is. All right, so 35 chains. To make a chain, you're going to wrap the yarn around the hook and bring it through the loop. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32, 33, 34, and 35. So here is our starting chain. And again, like I mentioned, that's going to be the height of our hat, okay? So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to zoom out a little bit, and we're going to grab our tape measure. And just to give you an idea of how long our starting chain is, because some of you like to use different yarn, and that's totally fine. We like to work in our stash. And from the bottom here where we tied that little knot all the way up, our starting chain is about 10 inches, okay? So just to give you an idea about that. Now let's work row 1. For row 1, what we're going to do is in the second chain from the hook, so this loop here does not count. And you know what? Let me zoom in a little bit so you can see that better. This loop here on the hook does not count. We're going to count 1, 2 chains, okay? So what we're going to do is insert our hook wrap the yarn around the hook, bring up a loop. You'll have 2 loops on the hook. Then what we're going to do is go into the next chain and do the same thing. Bring up a loop, you'll have 3 loops on the hook. Go to the next chain, do the same thing. Bring up a loop, 4 loops are on the hook. Go into the next chain, bring up a loop, 5 loops are on the hook. Go into the next chain, bring up a loop, and now you have 6 loops on your hook, okay? So this is how we're going to create our first star, okay? So then what we want to do is wrap the yarn around the hook and bring it through all 6 loops, and then we're going to chain 1, and that's it, okay? So let's work our next star. Okay, so for the first star we have completed. Our star now, when we did that chain 1, it created a hole at the top, or an eye, we can also call it. Okay, so what we're going to do is insert the hook into that eye and bring up a loop. Okay, now we're going to go in between the last 2 spikes that we worked. So see all these? It's almost like an upside down fan. So go in between the last 2 spikes that you worked and bring up a loop. You'll have 3 loops on your hook. Then you're going to go into that last chain that you worked, which is right here onto the side, and you're going to bring up a loop. You'll have 4 loops on your hook. Go into the next chain that you see and bring up a loop. You'll have 5 loops on your hook. Go into the next chain and bring up a loop. You'll have 6 loops on your hook, okay? So then what you want to do is wrap the yarn around the hook, bring it through all 6 of those loops, and chain 1. Once again, we now have 2 stars. Okay? So let's do this all the way across. We're going to do this whole row together because the star stitch, I know for some people can be kind of tricky. It's something that you need to do a few times and get a feel for it. If you want to, you can maybe try working up a little sample swatch to get comfortable with it first. Or you can work it up, a row or 2 of this, pull it out, try again, pull it out, try again. Okay, it's up to you. But we're going to go nice and slow and work through this together. Okay, what we want to do for our next star is go into the eye of the star we just created. Bring up a loop, 2 loops on the hook. Go in between those last 2 spikes worked of your last star. Bring up a loop, 3 loops are on the hook. Go in that last chain worked, bring up a loop, 4 loops are on the hook. Go into the next chain, bring up a loop, 5 loops are on the hook. Go into the next chain, bring up a loop, 6 loops are on the hook. Wrap the yarn around the hook, bring it through all 6 loops, and then chain 1. So that's our 3rd star. Now, to make our next star, go back into that eye of the last star you just worked, bring up a loop, 2 loops. Go in those last 2 spikes worked, bring up a loop, 3 loops. Go in that last chain worked, bring up a loop, 4 loops. Go in the next chain, bring up a loop, 5 loops. Go in the next chain, bring up a loop, 6 loops. Wrap the yarn around the hook, bring it through all 6 loops, and chain 1. Okay? I always like to give this a tug and kind of like open everything back up. And that's also why I like to go up a hook size. It can get very tight when you are using too small of a hook. So sometimes I find that the recommended hook size of the yarn that I'm using is not super suitable for this stitch. I like to get a little bit bigger of a hook. But you can experiment, and definitely always feel free to experiment. Okay, let's work our next star. Go into the eye of the star of the last star worked, bring up a loop, 2 loops. In between those last 2 spikes worked, bring up a loop, 3 loops. Go in that last chain worked, bring up a loop, 4 loops. Go in the next chain, bring up a loop, 5 loops are on the hook. Go in the next chain, bring up a loop, 6 loops are on the hook. Yarn around hook, bring through all 6 loops and chain 1. Let's do that again. Go into the eye of the star, bring up a loop, 2 loops. Go in those last 2 spikes worked, bring up a loop, 3 loops. Go in that last chain worked, bring up a loop, 4 loops are on the hook. Go in the next chain, bring up a loop, 5 loops are on the hook. go in the next chain, bring up a loop. 6 loops are on the hook. Yarn around hook, bring it through all 6 loops and chain 1. We are making some really pretty progress with our row here. Okay, let's do one together. And we're going to pick up speed just a little bit. And as always, you can back up the video as many times as you need in order to see anything you want again. Go into the eye of the star, bring up a loop. Go into the last 2 spikes worked, bring up a loop. Go into that last chain worked, bring up a loop. Go into the next chain, bring up a loop. And go into the next chain, bring up a loop. 6 loops should be on your hook. Yarn around hook. Bring it through all 6 loops and chain 1. And again, go into the eye of the star you just worked. Sometimes you might need to wiggle it in there if the eye is small. Bring up a loop. Go in those last 2 spikes worked, bring up a loop. Go into that last chain worked, bring up a loop. Go into the next chain, bring up a loop. Go into the next chain, bring up a loop. 6 loops are on the hook, yarn around hook, bring it through all 6 loops and chain 1. Okay, go into the eye of the star, bring up a loop, go into the last 2 spikes worked, in between those 2, bring up a loop, go in the last chain worked, bring up a loop, go in the next chain, bring up a loop, and the next chain and bring up a loop. Wrap yarn around hook, bring it through all 6 loops and chain 1. Okay, we are more than halfway done here. Go into the eye of the star, bring up a loop. Go in between the last 2 spikes worked, bring up a loop. Go into that last chain worked, bring up a loop. Go into the next chain, bring up a loop. Go into the next chain and bring up a loop. Okay, you should have 6 loops on the hook. Wrap the hook yarn around the hook, bring it through all 6 loops and chain 1. Now I like to give it a little tug just to straighten it all out. Okay, go into the eye of the star, bring up a loop. Go in between the last 2 spikes worked, bring up a loop. Go in that last chain worked, bring up a loop. Go in the next chain, bring up a loop. Go in the next chain, bring up a loop. 6 loops are on the hook. Wrap yarn around hook, bring it through all 6 loops and chain 1. Straighten things out a bit. Go into the eye of the star, bring up a loop. Go in between the last 2 spikes worked, bring up a loop. Go in the last chain worked, bring up a loop. Go into the next chain, bring up a loop. Go into the next chain, bring up a loop. 6 loops on the hook. Yarn around hook, bring through all 6 loops. I also wanted to mention, if you've done this stitch before, obviously you can skip ahead if you don't need to see every single one. But if you want to, crochet right along with me, just stick with me. We are almost to the end. Go into the eye of the star, bring up a loop. Go in between the last 2 spikes worked, bring up a loop. Go in the last chain worked, bring up a loop. Go into the next chain, bring up a loop. Go into the next chain, bring up a loop. 6 loops on the hook, yarn around hook. Bring it through all 6 loops and chain 1. Go into the eye of the star, bring up a loop. Go into the last 2 spikes worked, bring up a loop. Go in the last chain worked, bring up a loop. Go into the next chain, bring up a loop. Go into the next chain, bring up a loop. So you have 6 loops on the hook, yarn around hook, bring it through all 6 of those loops and chain 1. All right, we are getting so close here. Another thing you can do is kind of pull the chain and opens that eye up. Go into the eye, bring up a loop. Go in between the last 2 spikes worked, bring up a loop. Go into the last chain worked, bring up a loop. Go into the next chain, bring up a loop. Go into the next chain, bring up a loop. 6 loops on the hook, yarn around hook, bring it through all 6 loops and chain 1. You should have 1 chain left on your row. For that last chain, what we're going to do is work a half double crochet. So wrap the yarn around the hook, insert it into that last chain, bring up a loop, wrap yarn around hook, bring it through all 3 of those loops, okay? So, whoops, I dropped my hook again. So all of our row is complete. This is what row 1 should look like. It looks very pretty. It has so much pretty texture already, and it's just going to get prettier. Okay, so what we want to do now is move on to row 2. Row 2 is super easy. Okay, so for row 2, we're going to chain 2, 1, 2, and turn our work. Now, row 2 is easy, and it's easy because we're just going to be working 2 half double crochets in each one of these. Remember in the previous row, each one of our stars had an eye. We're going to be working each one of, in each eye, we're going to work 2 half double crochets, okay? So sometimes though, when I'm doing this, I need to flip it over and kind of peek because it looks different. As you can see, the back and the front look a little bit different. So sometimes I need to like flip it over and peek and just to make sure I'm working my half doubles in the right spot. Okay, so locate that first eye, and just to refresh, the half double is yarn round hook, inserted into that eye, bring up a loop, yarn round hook, bring through all 3 loops, okay? But you're gonna work 2 in there. So let me work my second one. Okay, let's hop over to the next star, flipping it over if you need to locate it, and work 2 half double crochets into the next eye. 1 and 2. All right, locate the next eye, work 2 half double crochets in there. 1 and 2. Flip things over if you need to see. I always need to flip it over for some reason. I just want to make sure that I'm putting it in the right spot, and that helps me a lot. So 2 half double crochets in the next eye, 2 half double crochets into the next eye, 1 and 2, 2 half double crochets into the next eye, 1 and 2, 2 half double crochets into the next eye, 1 and 2, 2 in the next eye, 1 and 2, 2 in the next eye, 1 and 2. Our colors are changing ever so slightly, and it's really pretty to see it. Okay, 2 into the next eye, 1 and 2, 2 half doubles into the next eye, 1 and 2. Again, flipping it over if you need to see from the other side, just to make sure. Some are more obvious than others. 1 and 2. Next eye, 2 half double crochets in that one, 1 and 2. And then 2 half double crochets in the next one, 1 and 2. And 2 half double crochets into the last eye of the row. All right, and then that very last stitch, it'll be right there on the side. We're also going to put 2 half double crochets in that last stitch of the row as well. Okay, so row 2 is complete. Row 2 is pretty easy. We can kind of zip through it pretty quickly. Okay, so for row 3, row 3 is going to be similar to the star row we did before for row 1, but we're not going to be working into chains. We got to do it a little bit differently. So for this row, we're going to chain 3, 1, 2, 3, and we're going to turn our work, and then we're going to work into the second chain from the hook. This loop here does not count, and I'm going to zoom in just a little bit so you can see here. So we're going to count 1, 2. So in the second chain from the hook, insert the hook, bring up a loop. You'll have 2 loops on the hook. Then insert the hook into the next chain, bring up a loop. You'll have 3 loops on the hook this time. Then we're going to insert the hook in each of the next 3 stitches. So we have a total of 6 loops on the hook, okay? So we're going to go 1, 2, and 3, okay? 6 loops are on the hook. Wrap the yarn around the hook, bring it through all 6 of those loops, and chain 1, okay? So as you can see, the 2 eyes now are lined up. Okay, so even though the beginning was a little bit different here, we're going to kind of work it the same way we worked it before, okay? So we're going to go back into the eye. Remember we did that before? Go into the eye of the star, bring up a, whoops, go into the eye, bring up a loop, go in between those last 2 spikes worked, and bring up a loop. Then we're going to go into the last chain we worked and bring up a loop. Now instead of going into the, remember we did into the chains, the next chain, and the next chain, we're going to go into the next stitch this time and bring up a loop. Go into the next stitch and bring up a loop, okay? 6 loops are on the hook, wrap yarn around hook, bring it through all 6 loops, and chain 1, okay? So now we have 2 cute little stars on our row. It's really shaping up beautifully, okay? Let's work across this row together. We're going to stick together for the whole row. Again, if you've worked the star stitch, if you're familiar with it, you can fast forward if you like. Okay, but if you want to hang out with me and do all these stitches together, definitely hang out. All right, so go into the eye, bring up a loop, go in between those last 2 spikes worked, bring up a loop, go in that last chain worked, bring up a loop, go in the next stitch, bring up a loop, and go in the next stitch and bring up a loop. 6 loops on the hook, yarn around hook, bring it through all 6 loops and chain 1. We really are starting to see some of the variegated colors as well. It's very pretty. Very tonal and heathered. I just love the soft look of it. Okay, back to this. Go into the eye and bring up a loop. Go in between the last 2 spikes worked and bring up a loop. Go in the last chain worked and bring up a loop. Go in the next stitch and bring up a loop. Go in the next stitch and bring up a loop. 6 loops on the hook. Bring it through all 6 loops and chain 1. Okay, go into the eye of the last star worked. I need to wiggle it in there sometimes. Bring up a loop. Go in between the last 2 spikes worked, bring up a loop. Go in that last chain worked, bring up a loop. Go in the next stitch worked, bring up a loop. And the next stitch worked and bring up a loop. 6 loops are on the hook. Yarn around hook, bring it through all 6 loops and chain 1. Go in the eye of the last star. Go in between the last 2 spikes of the last star. Go in the last chain you worked. Go in the next stitch and the next stitch. Yarn around hook, bring it through all 6 loops and chain 1. Go into the eye of the last star, go into the last 2 spikes worked, go into that last chain worked, go into that next stitch, and the next stitch. Yarn around hook, bring it through all 6 loops and chain 1. We're making some really great progress. Next, go in that last eye worked, bring up a loop, in between the last 2 spikes worked, bring up a loop, last chain worked, bring up a loop, next stitch, bring up a loop, next stitch, bring up a loop. Wrap yarn around hook, bring it through all 6 of those loops and chain 1. I'm going to get a little bit more yarn here. Okay, go into the eye, bring up a loop, go in those last 2 spikes of that previous star, bring up a loop, go into the last chain worked, bring up a loop, go into the next stitch, bring up a loop, go into the next stitch, bring up a loop. Yarn around hook, bring it through all 6 loops and chain 1. Okay, go into the eye from the previous star, bring up a loop, go in between those last 2 spikes you worked, bring up a loop, go in that last chain, bring up a loop, go in the next stitch, bring up a loop, go in the next stitch, bring up a loop. Yarn around hook, bring it through all 6 loops and chain 1. Okay, we are making some pretty progress. I'm loving it. Go in the eye, bring up a loop, go in between the last 2 spikes, bring up a loop, go in that last chain, bring up a loop, go in the next stitch, bring up a loop, next stitch, bring up a loop. yarn around hook, bring through all 6 loops and chain 1. Go in the eye, bring up a loop, last 2 spikes, bring up a loop, last chain, bring up a loop, next stitch, bring up a loop, next stitch, bring up a loop. Yarn around hook, bring it through all 6 loops and chain 1. And then we're going to do the same thing. Go into the eye. Whoops, I went into the wrong spot here. Sometimes you need to open it up a little bit, and that's okay. Bring up a loop, go in that eye, bring up a loop. Go in between the last 2 spikes, bring up a loop. Go in that last chain, bring up a loop. Go in the next stitch, bring up a loop. Go in the next stitch, bring up a loop. Yarn around hook, bring through all 6 loops and chain 1. Okay, we're moving right along. Go into the eye, bring up a loop. Go into those last 2 spikes of the star, bring up a loop. Go in that chain, bring up a loop. Go in the next stitch, bring up a loop. Go into the next stitch, bring up a loop. Wrap the yarn around all 6 of those loops and chain 1. Now, that last stitch of the row, we're at the end of the row here, we're going to work a half double crochet to finish off the row. Okay? So remember, yarn around hook, bring it through all 3 loops. Okay? So here is our progress so far. So for the rest of your hat, it's not a hat yet, it's more of a rectangle at this point, a strip, if you will. Okay, before we continue though, I wanted to give you a quick measurement of our little strip because like I mentioned earlier in the video, the starting chain is going to be a little bit longer than the fabric that you achieve. So I am at about 9 inches in height. So that'll be the height of our hat like I mentioned before. So what we're going to do is we're working now rows 2 and 3, 2 and 3 over and over and over again until your hat is as big or round as you would want it to be, the circumference of it. I'm going to take mine to about 20 inches. That's a good comfortable circumference that I like. I like a little bit of snugness. I don't like my hat to move too much. However, definitely work the circumference that you feel is best. Now, if you're making this for a child, you might want your circumference to be smaller. If you're making this and you want more of a looser fit, you might want your circumference to be bigger, okay? So I'm going to take mine to 20 inches, but definitely as it gets longer, sort of wrap it around your head, or if you're making it for someone, get a measurement with a tape measure of the circumference of their head and go by that, okay? So this is very customizable, but I did want you to know I'm going to take mine to about 20 inches. So I have about 9 inches in height, and I'm going to do, or width, I guess you could say, but it's going to be the height of the hat. But so far our strip is 9 inches. And then I'm going to take the rows 2 and 3, 2 and 3 over and over until it's about 20 inches. Okay, so keep repeating rows 2 and 3, 2 and 3 until you get the height that you need to give you that hat circumference. Okay, just working that last stitch of our little rectangle here that we're creating, and we are now finished. Now I wanted to point out, as you've been working your rows, you may have noticed that your stripes may be slanted a little bit. That happens quite commonly when you work lots of rows of star stitch, and actually that is going to add a little bit of a swirl appearance to our hat. So if you are experiencing this as you've worked your rows, it's totally fine. It's going to give us a little bit of a design element to our piece, okay? So the next thing we're going to do is assemble our hat. So what we want to do next is, before we cut the yarn, grab a long length of tail. I would guess about 24 inches and cut the yarn. Now I wanted to point out we still have quite a bit of yarn here. We're going to make a cute pom-pom when we're finished. That's totally optional. You don't have to do that, but I'm going to show you how to if you want to. Okay, so we have our 24-inch long-ish tail. And what we're going to do is wrap the yarn around the hook, and we're going to pull it all the way through that loop, okay? The next thing we want to do is we're going to seam. We're going to leave this tail alone for a minute, but we're going to seam our hat. Now, as you can see, the slanting that I was mentioning before, when you fold it in, it perfectly matches itself. See how it does that? This slants this way, this slants this way, and when you look at your hat, it's going to give you some nice diagonal stripes, and I think that adds a little bit of something to that. Okay, so what we want to do now is seam our hat. So the side that faced you when you worked the star row, not the half double crochet row, but the star row, is considered the right side of your work. So if we open this up, you can see there's a difference. You don't see the stars as clearly on this side, but you see them very clearly on this side. So this is the outside, or the quote public facing side of the work when you're going to be wearing your hat. So turn this rectangle inside out, if you will. We're going to leave this tail intact for our when we cinch up our hat. Okay, so leave that tail alone. And if you had a long enough tail for when you began, you can use that to seam this part up. But if not, you can cut yourself a new piece of yarn. Okay, so I'm going to cut myself a new piece of yarn, and we can take care of that other tail later. So this is about 18 to 24 inches long as well. And thread that up. And then what we're going to do is kind of sandwich these edges together. And we want to keep them lined up nice and neat. For a hat, it's especially important because you're going to be wearing this brim along your forehead. So that is going to be especially important as you do your seaming. So try to keep it nice and neat when you do that. And I'm going to just tie a knot to get my seams started. Okay. So what I'm going to do is line everything up nice and neat. Now you may have where you began your starting edge, this tan bottom part here. Mine is a little bit stretchier than where I left off. That's okay. Just try to line it up as neatly as possible. And then we're going to work a whip stitch. All a whip stitch is you're going to take your edges and sandwich them together, and you're going to just go in both layers like this and bring it around, back up, bring it around, back up. And we're just creating a spiral. It's a spiral stitch, okay? And that is, when we turn it right side out, it'll be pretty invisible and nice and neat looking, okay? So just go in both layers with your needle, and we're just going to go around and around, and we're going to, every so often, just double check that everything's lined up. We're just going to go through it again, through there again, through there again, all the way across, okay? And this is a pretty small rectangle, so it's not going to take too long to do this part. And we're using the same yarn as where we left off, so even if you have a self-striping yarn like this, it's going to blend in pretty nicely. If you're using a fuzzier yarn, this is kind of a fuzzy yarn, like it's not like a smooth, very defined ply. It has like a little bit of a fuzz to it. It will also be very forgiving when you seam the edges as well. Okay, so we're just going to go around and around with our whip stitch, leaving that tail alone for now. Make sure your edges are still lined up nice and neat. Go all the way across, okay? Now we're going to come up to the edge, and I like to just take it right over that edge with my seam, because if I just come up to the edge, when we open it up, see how there's like a dip there? Because both sides curve. Actually, let me zoom in so you can really see that. Both sides curve. This side curves in, this side curves in. So you want to go a little bit beyond those edges, okay? So take your needle and just kind of come off to the side a little bit as well, okay? Make sure everything's nice and neat. Give it a little tug if you need to. Pull your needle out. And then what you can do is that long tail we cut, you can tie it rather to the end that we just worked, okay? The next thing we want to do is we're going to cinch up our hat, okay? So here is our edge. If you need to peek, look at the other side. It looks nice and neat. And then what we're going to do, while it's still inside out like this, we're going to take our tapestry needle and go ahead and thread. We're going to weave all these ends in just a bit. Okay? So what we want to do is just take our needle and go over and under, over and under. It doesn't have to be super exact and precise. Just try to space them out as equally and neatly as possible. but we're just going to go over and under all along this edge here. Okay, this is going to be the top edge of our hat. And every so often you can pull it through just to kind of reduce the bulk a little bit. But we're going to go over and under, over and under, over and under, all the way around. And this is going to create the top crown part of our hat. It's such a simple, pretty way to construct a hat. Okay, and I have a couple other hat tutorials where I do the same thing, where you make a rectangle, seam it, and then cinch it. Okay, so we're just going all the way around, and this will all be, even though we have this bright purple that we're sending through some of these like more neutral areas, it will all blend and look lovely when we're finished. Okay, so just keep going in and out, all the way around. And actually our tail here where we left, or where we began rather, indicates to us that we're back at the beginning. Okay, okay, so pull that through. And then what we're going to do is take our yarn and you just want to pull it. Now, you don't want to do this too tight or too hard. You want to be very careful, because what can happen is the yarn can snap. And when that happens, you kind of have to start over. So just be very, very gentle when you do this, okay? And I like to do a pom-pom on hats that I cinch like this. You don't have to, but it does give a nice little finish to it, okay? Then what we're going to do is you want to just straighten everything out. And while this is inside out, let's go ahead and you can either weave these in, or this is the inside of the hat. You're not really going to see it. You can snip. Now these will show, so you do want to weave these in. And this is a good example of when you weave this in, you want to stay in the same color with your tail. Because what will happen is if you travel into another color area, it will definitely stick out. You'll have this like bright pink tail traveling through a different part of the hat, okay? So I have this other tail here that's sort of like this beige color. I'm going to just send this tail through the beige stripe over here on this side. Okay, so go in one direction, come back in the other direction, and then we can snip that. And now it's time for our big hat reveal. We're going to turn this inside out, and the crown looks very pretty the way we've cinched it. And we're just going to straighten everything out, get your stitches nice and lined up. Okay, and then we are ready to make a pom-pom for our hat as well, okay? So we can sort of slide our hat out of the way, and I'm going to show you how to make a very, very easy pom-pom. If you follow my channel, you'll know that I don't use any fancy tools. I am going to swap my little tiny scissors for big scissors for this part, just because we need to give it a haircut. Now, you can cut a piece of yarn, actually have a scrap here, but cut a piece of yarn about 12 to 18 inches long. And then what we're going to do is we're going to start wrapping the yarn around all 4 fingers. So what you want to do is take the yarn, and I like to scoot my ring out of the way just so it doesn't get tangled up, but run the yarn down the middle of your hand, and you're just going to start wrapping it around all 4 fingers. I'm going to wrap mine until this yarn is gone. And when we rejoin, I'll tell you how many times that happened to be. So I wrapped my yarn about 350 times, and that sounds like a lot, and it is, and it makes a nice big thick bundle. This is thinner yarn. For a super bulky yarn, you would wrap it less times, but I wrapped it a bunch of times because I want a nice big pom-pom. So what you want to do is carefully slip your hand out of this bundle, and it's a nice thick bundle, so we're going to get a big fluffy pom-pom with this. And then we're going to lay our little bundle down on the table, keeping those ends pointed down so they don't get lost. And then take your yarn and you can just tie it. And you want to be very careful, once again, not to snap the yarn, but you want to get it tied down as tightly as possible, okay? So you can put your finger there. You can have someone help you and put their finger in there so you can tie it. It's a little bit of a balancing act here between getting it tight enough and getting your fingers out of the way. Okay, so then take your little bundle and you're going to cut all the loops that you see. Okay, so you can really dig your scissors in there and just start cutting loops. Okay, and as you can see, we're going to get a nice fluffy pom-pom. And it's going to look a little wild at first. That's totally normal when you make pom-poms this way, but it's going to make for a nice, dense, fluffy pom-pom when we're finished. If you notice, I'm still holding those ends that I tied. They're going to be our handles, and we're going to use those ends to tie onto the hat in just a minute. So what you want to do is just keep cutting, cutting, cutting all of these loops that you see. And as we give it a little haircut, obviously it needs one, but as we give it our little haircut, we're also going to, you might find some more buried way in there, okay? So we have a gigantic, crazy looking pom-pom right now, but we're going to give it a haircut and it's going to kind of dense up a little bit, okay? So give it a nice heavy trim, okay? And if you find any more loops, like here, just found a little row of loops, go ahead and give those a trim as well. So we're just going all around, and I don't know about you, but I find this to be very fun to give it a little trim. And because we're using a self-striping yarn for our hat, it's extra fun to make a pom-pom with this type of yarn. We can scoot all that out of the way. You can use this for stuffing things later. But when you use a self-striping yarn like this, your pom-pom also has a little bit of striping as well. So as you cut, you can see more of those stripes. Mine almost has like a swirled effect, but all those pretty stripes will be revealed in the self-striping yarn. And you can see sort of exactly the way you may have wrapped it as well. Okay, so just keep cutting and trimming, and every so often give it a little fluff to kind of get all those like stray pieces out of there. Give it a nice fluff. It'll get some of those crumbs out as well. And what you can do is just keep kind of pushing and pulling along until you get the look that you're after. Okay, I wanted a nice, fluffy, kind of dense looking pom-pom. And don't forget up around the bottom too. Now this part will sit on your hat, but you don't want it to look shaggy either, okay? So just keep trimming. Make sure you're getting a nice kind of spherical shape with your pom-pom. So that will require you to sort of spin it around at every angle. See, there's a couple loose pieces here, but that will allow you to get it seen at every angle. We're gonna fluff it back up, fluff it back up. See, we revealed a long piece, okay? So now, once your pom-pom has the look that you want it to have, there's no stray pieces, and you might need to kind of like, they might pop out a little bit, you might need to like kind of go back, like see, we need to go back and trim that up a little bit. But once everything looks the way you want it to look, you can either use your hands. Actually, my tapestry needle has disappeared under my floof here, all my little clippings. As a side note, it's probably best to do that over a trash can or like a storage bag if you're saving them. But I did them on my table. Okay, so we're going to go in through the top of the hat here with our tapestry needle. I took one of those strands, one of those little handles that I mentioned before. And then you'll have a little hole at the top where you cinched. So I like to go on either side of that center hole, just so that gives me a good marker of where it is and how it will be centered. Okay, so go ahead and pull both little pieces through, and then you can kind of flip your hat out like this and take your two strands that you just tied and tie it nice and tight. Again, you don't want to break your yarn, but you want to get that nice and tight, because anything you wear like this, it'll get sort of tossed around. It's important to make sure it's very secure. And then you can just snip or weave the ends in, whatever you like. These are be hidden inside your hat, so it's not super important. But our hat is complete, and it has a fun pom-pom, and I'm still finding some little ends. Our pom-pom had a lot of wraps. 350 wraps is a lot of wraps for a pom-pom. So that means it's a lot of yarn to trim. So if you do find some strays here and there, you know, just snip those off. So our hat is complete, and we have a little bit of a diagonal swirl, which I love. We have a gorgeous multicolor pom-pom, the lovely star stitch that I just enjoy making very much. And that is our hat. So that is how you crochet and assemble the Raspberry Crumble Hat. Thanks so much for watching, and be sure and click the subscribe button to get all the latest Fiber Flux video updates. Thanks again.